We're in the last chapters of this week, and I'm going to do a quick video lecture on parenting and also talking about the process of divorce. And I know that is a lot to throw into one last week. Usually in my full semester classes, we get to take full week for each. But I wanted to address these very important parts of relationships, both the choice to go ahead and parent or decide to have children, whether it be married or outside of marriage, and the process of divorce. Many people have experienced that, and it affects our families, our friends. It affects all of us in a lot of ways. So let's first talk about having children. In a country that has a cultural value such as the U.S. for having children and seeing that as a significant status symbol, we call that a pronatal environment. And so pronatalism is something that a lot of people don't pay attention to a lot of the time, but if you, especially are a female, have ever gotten to a certain age where it was appropriate based on, being an adult or being married, and been approached by people to say, when are you going to have children? That is a sign of pronatalism. That, once again, going back to that evolutionary theory we were looking at earlier, that societies have this drive to survive through children. And so we definitely experience that environment, and especially this affects females, but it also affects men as well, as it's seen as a rite of passage. Now, in 2016, the fertility rate in the United States was the lowest it has ever been. There were 62 births per 1,000 women aged 15 to 24, which is down 1% from 2015. There were 3,941,109 babies born in 2016. In the analysis issued by the National Center for Health Statistics, researchers report that birth rates declined to record lows in all groups under age 30. Among women ages 20 to 24, the decline was 4%. For women 25 to 29, the rate fell 2%. And so what we're seeing here is, again, as people are choosing to marry later, they're also choosing to either not have children or have children later. That affects the entire rate overall. So when you see that, don't assume that people are not choosing to have children. It's just when people have children does affect the overall statistic. And we will see in, for example, other countries where it's expected to have children, even sometimes in your teens, higher birth rates. Sometimes we also see higher mortality rates as well. So it's important for us to keep in mind that we, in the U.S., still face issues with mortality rate. We rank 17th in certain aspects and areas. It depends in the United States on still being able to have safe childbirth for everybody. So what is it about having kids? They're cute, they're adorable, they're wonderful. I love seeing little ones. Just saw a niece today, and just they're adorable, but they also cost a lot of money. And when you're making a decision about deciding to be a parent, typically what we hope is that people have the ability to make that plan. But sometimes we don't, and we have to be aware that there are costs in raising children. The direct financial costs usually are out-of-pocket expenses for things such as food, clothing, housing, and education. These are the things that we expect for the care of a child. But then there's also the opportunity costs. Those opportunities that you might have had, for example, if you didn't have a child, maybe you were working at a job and you're expected to go part-time, or you were with a bunch of friends and you were all planning to go to Hawaii, but now that you have a child, that's all gone. Those are things we call opportunity costs, and a lot of times people don't take those into consideration. The birth rate among unmarried women is also something that is happening, and this isn't all just because people are, not with a couple or with a partner. As we said earlier, most of the increases in childbirth outside of wedlock involve people who are cohabiting, but that birth rate among unmarried women went down to 42.1% per 42.1 per thousand from 43.5 in 2015, which means our birth rate is going down. It's a drop of 3%, and that is the 8th consecutive year of that decline since the peak of 51.8 in 2007 and 2008. So we are seeing divorce go down, and we are seeing childbearing go down. Now, we do recognize there are differences by race. 28.4% of white babies had unmarried parents when we're talking about, for example, going back to that unmarried and outside of marriage. 28.4% of white babies had unmarried parents, 69.7% of Black babies, and 52.5% of Hispanic babies in the United States were from couples or from mostly cohabiting, but possibly single parenthood as well, that didn't have both parents married. So what's the cost? Well, this can vary, but we often give you some big costs about what will show up on the medical bill, and also the differences over time. The average total price charged for pregnancy and newborn care on average was $30,000 for a vaginal delivery, and a C-section is $50,000, with commercial insurance paying out an average of $18,329 to $27,866. This was a Truvan study that was done recently looking at those numbers. Now, the interesting aspect here then is if a person doesn't have insurance, what do we do? There are lots of state programs and types of things that can help people with those direct costs so that they can qualify for. But again, there are a lot of times people don't have insurance. They follow in that in between state assistance, and these are the numbers in reality. Women with insurance pay out of pocket an average of $3,400 according to a recent survey by Childbirth Connection, which is connected with pharmaceuticals. And one of the groups behind that maternity cost report was really trying to get a good estimate compared to what was going on 2 decades ago. And 2 decades ago, typically nobody paid anything. It was a small fee for often a private hospital room or a television. Obviously, some of those costs, when you look at $3,400 on average with insurance, might include upgrades and hospital suites and the way people are choosing to have their child. But we can't expect to just walk out without any costs when we have a child. So one of the most important things, I think, for people deciding to have a child is to be able to see the process, to know that the minute that child, whether coming vaginally or if you're experiencing that child through C-section, that they are a breathing, living entity. Even if you're going to adopt that child in that moment, you're still in that process of seeing that life. And so please watch the live birth video. It's one of the highlights of being part of intimate relationships. I've actually had students tell me later that they are choosing to adopt because of this video, but I think it's important. It's about 7 minutes long. It's not very long, but it goes through detailed expression of watching this doctor talk about as a baby is born into the world, and you get to see the entire process. So take time to do that. So wanting children and being able to have child is a concern for many people, both male and female. And we can't go through all of the fertility issues, but it's important for people, especially if they're in an intimate relationship where you might be considering having children together, that you're able to talk, have that very clear expectation of maybe wanting children, but at the same time, what happens if? It's not something that's easily done. I don't know if I ever can remember a really honest conversation in my own life about those types of things. I mean, there's good talks, but it's like sometimes we will tell you these things in these classes, and it's not easy. It's a vulnerable moment. But when you do decide, or if you think about it, one thing you have to recognize in our current society is that we have really gone into the medicalization of childbirth as the way. There are doulas, there are options where people use some sort of birth mothers and people who are assistants, maybe nurse practitioners. But Almost all of it is expected to be something that's in a medical event, in use of drugs or some sort of technological intervention if there's crisis. And so there's a lot of discussion about whether that's how people want to have their children. And that would be a good discussion for people to have when they're considering this. Also, we have to recognize that a lot of people really have difficulty getting pregnant, and assisted reproductive technology, which is the acronym ART, is where fertility treatments are given with either egg or sperm or both, and they're handled in that medicalized way. And there's a video, again, that I think is important for you to watch. It shows the whole process of in vitro, and it has also some background information of how people felt while they were going through that. It includes all fertility treatments, which means eggs and embryos are handled outside of the body and reinserted. There's also high possibilities of twins. Those types of things have to be talked about as well. And of course, the most common form is in vitro fertilization. That makes up 99% of the procedures. And again, that's what the video is about. The actual definition for that is extracting a woman's egg, fertilizing the egg in the laboratory, then transferring that resulting embryo into the woman's uterus through the cervix. However, there's also lots of different drugs that have to be taken. You have to take all kinds of hormones to make sure that the body is ready. And it also can cause, as we talked about in the last section, major stressors and sometimes stress pileup when with such an expense, and it is quite an expensive procedure, it doesn't work out. So this is a very difficult time sometimes for couples, which often leads to a possibility of adoption, which is the mechanism by which adults legalize their parental relationships to non-biological children. There are different kinds of adoptions, and you may check if you're in the state of Kansas. You can go online and see Kansas Adopt, where we have a large listing of available children through our system. Most of them are not babies, so it's not about working with a parent at that time, but it's usually with people that are in our foster care systems. But there are two different kinds of adoption that we typically look at. Closed adoption, which is where the identifying information is sealed and unavailable to all parties. Now, there are some people that can do private investigators, that type of thing. But really, closed adoption is where the parent themselves really or the biological parent doesn't want to have information or have that be shared. Whereas an open adoption is a type of adoption that involves direct contact between biological and adoptive parents. The total number of adoptions taking place in the U.S. has fallen from a count of 133,737 adoptions in 2007 to 110,373 in 2014. And a lot of that is related to a lot of closed border relationships, because we have had a lot of out of U.S. adoptions. And so when we look at adoption, we also have to recognize it's not always children that are within the U.S., that we have lots of adoptions that take place in the U.S. from countries outside the border. More than half of this decline then can be attributed to the significant drop in the number of inter-country adoptions by Americans. There's also a significant decline in the number of kinship-related adoptions, meaning people who are related to a person that might take that child, maybe a brother, a sister of the biological parent, or grandparents, which is something we had seen quite a bit. Watch the adoption video. That's also in part of this module, and it will help you understand a little bit more about that process. Finally, you have to recognize that once you have a child, and if all things go, whether you adopt, have had in vitro, have children vaginally, C-section, however they come into the world and are part of your life, they are dependent on you. From that early age, they are watching you, they are imitating you. All of these skills that you've developed trying to think about your relationships are something that you have to put into practice with your children. And you can't force that. You have to watch how they imitate you. Now, one of my favorite videos that I like to put on here is 100 kids imitating their parents. I think it's one of the best ways for you to see how kids pick up things. And we see this every day. Maybe you've been around children, but they are watching you, and you are suddenly the pattern for them to watch as socialization takes process. And they want to see the world through a process that makes sense. It's not, they don't have the brains that we have. By the time we get to a certain age, I think we've forgotten what it's like to have childlike brains. And it can be very distressing. I actually know of a quote where somebody said, basically, all of us have one thing in common on this planet: we survived our parents. And that's a very important thing, is that children often are surviving their parents because we're not perfect at this. But you do need to know about a couple things that are important as a parent. First, primary appraisal is important. It involves noticing conflict and evaluating whether it represents a threat. So a child doesn't know how to necessarily understand that threat. And this is where attachment theory, which we talked about three modules ago, plays a primary key, is for understanding that sense of security, that sense of that parent being there for the child, even if the crisis, they can sometimes pick up on a crisis or assume something is a crisis when it isn't, and they really need to have that communication. Secondary appraisal happens in which the adult conflict is perceived so personally, and this is what happens if you don't deal with the primary appraisal. They see it as something that they've caused. They personally feel that threat, and they start to self-blame, or at least this is something that is seen on a regular basis for children. They felt like they caused the divorce or the fight. These are things that we do. And as parents, you can be aware that I invite you to take a parenting class, by the way, or family and social context, which is another class I teach. But that self-blame we see holding on to children all the way through the rest of their lives if they haven't had that dealt with. And they see themselves as causing that or being responsible for that tension. So we need to watch those development models and make sure that they understand that intimacy sometimes involves conflict. It's important for us to help them understand that. If conflict is experienced on a regular basis, children may just do a couple things. They may desensitize. For example, if it's a particularly violent experience where they hear their parents or siblings or family members always constantly becoming accustomed to that arguing in the background, they may become desensitized to that. They also may become sensitized where they're completely reactive to what they're exposed to, so that they're trying to fix the problem. And they've taken it on based on that self-blame that we talked about before. Another aspect of childhood observation appears that siblings are also part of the picture, and there is some competition. Everybody knows that not all of our parents love us the same way. They say they love us equally, but that may be with different types of cups. And so the cups may look different. That holds that type of parental love and attention. So one thing you will have to recognize when you're thinking about parenting and that relationship you have with your children is that there is differential treatment. Looking for differences in how each sibling is treated. This is natural. It's growing up. It's learning that differentiation. It's also recognizing how that treatment can sometimes seem unfair, and sometimes it is. Sometimes society has treated different sibling ages at an unfair age. For example, boys sometimes are valued more than girls in certain situations, but then you turn it and girls are sometimes valued more than boys in certain situations. So being aware of the times where that differential treatment happens and talking to them and asking them how they feel about that, trying to process with that is an important part of parenting and having children. I invite you to also watch this video in Module 6. Again, I think all my videos must be my favorites, but How to Raise Successful Kids by Dr. Julia Lythcott-Haims. She is the Dean of Students, freshman for the freshman class at Stanford University. She deals with incoming freshmen, and she talks about how as freshmen come in, she is often dealing with the overparenting, helicopter parenting. So there's paying attention, helping kids self-differentiate, understanding that differentiation, but also watching yourself on living vicariously through your kids. So pay attention to that video. It's about 20 minutes. It'll be worth your time. So we're going to move on to divorce. I know it seems like a big jump, but these are really important subjects, and I like to end on them in the year because these take into context all of the different theories that we've looked at, all of the different venues and contexts. Divorce is a process. And as much as we see 80% of the population more likely to marry sometime in their life, we see ranges of 50% of the population, or 50% of divorces in some context are ending up in divorce, whether that be in the first year of marriage, which is typically where that 50% comes from. But we also see a large majority of divorces in remarriages. This is a process that includes many years of conflict and separation, and it's not easy to get through, but it can be gotten through. Officially, the technical language for divorce is the legal dissolution of a marriage by a court or another competent body. It's expensive. So as we talk about weddings last week and having children, it's just under $28,000 on average to actually go through a wedding. And now divorce costs on average $15,000 to $30,000. So I often tell people it really saves you a lot of money if you're not really sure about getting married, because you may end up with $15,000 to $30,000 or more out of a divorce. And so it's not trying to scare people, but we have to recognize how important this can cause stressors, especially in our current economic environment. Divorce rates by age: under 20 years of age, women are at 27.6%, men are at 11.7%. I'm going to jump to the end of this one. 35 to 39-year-olds are at 5.1%, and men are 6.5%. So you will notice that younger people tend to divorce more. Doesn't mean that it doesn't happen at older ages, but if you make it past a certain time, usually we see less divorce. The marriage breakup rate in America for first marriage is 41 to 50%. The rate after second marriage is 60 to 67%, and the rate in America for third marriage is at 73 to 74%. People do beat odds, but there are a lot of times where getting married again and again isn't going to solve the problem. Going back to what we've talked about with intimate relationships, we see people repeating the same processes, not communicating. So they get excited about that initial attraction. They often find those first few years are okay, and then really working through some of that accuracy of their lives and what they want is something that they haven't done. So this is due to the fact that, we see a lot of people that go back and forth with this, and this is going to be part of our society for a long time because divorce has become part of how people decide to dissolve a relationship. Once again, go back and look at that video, though I shared a couple modules back. Not all children are affected by divorce in a negative way. A divorce can be handled well. And sometimes if the child has been stressing or taking on the pain of the parents, it is better in the long run. And we see it just depends on what's going on in the situation of that divorce. Rates on divorce have been dropping, though, during the last few decades. It indicates that marriage has lasted longer in the 21st century as compared to the previous. And in the 90s, especially, was our highest rates of divorce. So we're seeing a lot more couples that prefer to live in a longer relationship. Now, I want to talk about the phases of separation, and then that's what's going to end our whole entire module. Why divorce is important for all of our relationships is that it does affect all of our relationships. It's not just about the two people that are choosing to end that relationship. Children are sometimes involved, siblings, parents, families, friends, communities, coworkers. And so we see a lot going on in these phases of separation that are important for us to be aware of. And if you can think about that in this class ahead of time, if you ever have to go through divorce, which I hope never happens, maybe you can remember some of these things and know that this is part of that process. First, there's pre-separation, when one or both partners starts to think about the benefits of the separation, because the couple may not fully know what to go forward with. Now, this is not often disclosed to the full family and friends in this stage, but people often pick up something's going wrong. The second phase is early separation, where couples face a series of questions that need to be answered and issues they need to face. Okay, if we're going to do this, who's going to move out? Who's going to take the kids? How should finances be separated? This isn't necessarily done in this nice, neat way. In fact, this is the place where we start to see people's anxiety rise, and oftentimes violence sometimes ensue in language. And so there's a lot of blame that can happen if people don't know how to go through this phase without communicating clearly. And once again, going back to the motivation, that they're not trying to be just justified with their motivations about being right, but instead being accurate with their motivations and why they're going through this. The third phase is the mid-separation phase. This is where the realities of daily living, such as maintaining 2 households, visitation with children, living in a reduced income setting, because you've not made all the decisions. And this is where the fights just escalate to the highest level because of that adjustment. And it is often a very high stress environment. It crosses over sometimes into your work life if you have work. Family sometimes take on the stressors and themselves will take crossover onto themselves. So this is a very difficult time, and often it's not the beginning of a divorce that's difficult. It's getting into the mire of the actual process of separation itself. Then finally, there's late separation phase, where the couple must learn to live as 2 single people again. They have to decide what's next. And as they make those decisions, are they first going through a legal separation, which some states require before they can go through a divorce, or are they allowed to go ahead and divorce? That difference is legal separation is the binding agreement signed by both spouses that provides details about child support mainly, and it also provides details about living conditions, that kind of thing. And then it also goes through the actual divorce itself. Now, there's a lot of stations that you go through also as well. While you're going through all these phases, you may go through emotional stations where you are torn by the whole process, who are on your side, who's not on your side. The legal aspects can be grueling, especially when you're getting legal advice from lawyers that may seem to be without any empathy toward the other party. Economically, you're going to go through stations where you're recognizing how difficult it can be to assume single life after having shared incomes. Co-parenting, recognizing your new community, who's going to be present with you as friends. And then there's many psychic dimensions of divorce in which people have to go through that life and try to capture and experience and try to share that with others. And sometimes people actually leave and aren't as close, and you find that people you thought were close to you aren't, and others may hopefully step in. But it's a very difficult thing. But the one thing about divorce is that if it's done for the purposes of starting new life and new relationships, that we have more support for people as they're going through that. It's never easy. It is something that's painful. One of the hardest things that we ever have to go through. So as we look at all the different things that we've looked at, what I want you to know most is that we are a people that have many relationships in our lives. We have so many different ways in which we intersect with others. And I hope that no matter what you go through, that you feel a sense of having some tools and the ability, even as a sociological observer, to see how our world works in the society with relationships and be a better contributor to helping people understand how important it is for them to know themselves and have that mutual vulnerability with others and curiosity of others, and just make our relationships as full as they possibly can be. Thanks for listening, and have a good night or a good day.